Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about the Spectrum Centre. So the Spectrum Centre is actually 10 years old this year. I'm sorry, the text's a bit small, but essentially what the Spectrum Centre was set up to do was to try to understand people's experiences of bipolar disorder, and particularly looking at developing new psychological approaches to working with these experiences, and looking at, importantly, how we translate those into clinical practice, into real-world settings. So this isn't an academic exercise. We're really keen to come up with things that can actually be used in practice. Oh. What did I do?
Don't worry.
Okay, so the purpose of the event today is to highlight the importance of personal recovery in bipolar, to hear the different perspectives on bipolar from the range of people here. So we've got a range of people who have lived experience, who work clinically, who do research in this area, and the idea is to really get that broad range of perspectives and to launch these new materials that Chris spoke about and that we're going to introduce you to later in the day. So just to give you a brief overview, you should have a program on your desk, but essentially I'm going to do an overview and a welcome, and then we're delighted to welcome Stephen Kitchen, who's the new Chief Exec of Bipolar UK. We've then got a series of brief presentations about bipolar recovery experiences from a range of personal, professional, and academic perspectives, and then we'll after the break, we'll launch into the e-tools. So just to orientate ourselves, this is obviously very familiar to people in this room, but bipolar disorder is a very common condition. So it's estimated that 1 in 100 people will experience bipolar, and a lot more than that will have bipolar spectrum conditions or bipolar experiences. And this is important because actually, in terms of the amount of funding that's spent both clinically and in terms of research, it's very low compared with the high prevalence of this condition. So it's generally a fairly poorly recognized condition. And the reason that it's important that we focus on bipolar is not only the personal cost to people's lives, but just in terms of economics, the cost to the UK has been estimated to be £5.2 billion per year. This was a King's Fund report. And it's mainly, those costs are mainly through rates of unemployment and actually costs of service use as well. So in terms of impact, obviously self-harm is very high in people with bipolar experiences, and as are rates of drug use, alcohol misuse, etc. So why are we interested in personal recovery? Well, traditionally services have tended to focus on clinical recovery, which is really about how do we reduce the symptoms that are generally associated with bipolar and prevent relapse. And that's really important. But I guess the recovery movement has been about arguing that actually often the experience of living alongside those experiences, but living a fulfilling and meaningful life, is more important to people than just reducing the symptoms. Often reducing the symptoms is a big part of that, but it's not all of it. So recovery is about focusing on what is important to the individual in terms of their life and making that the focus of the experience. Okay, so just focusing on some of the work that we've been doing in Spectrum. So we've been interested in looking at some of the positive aspects of bipolar experiences. And this is important because people often struggle with taking medication or engaging with some of the treatments that are available. And some of the reasons that they tell us are that actually some aspects of bipolar for some people can have very positive aspects to it. There was a really interesting documentary that many of you may have seen that Stephen Fry presented, and he actually was speaking to people who had found their bipolar experiences had really benefited them in terms of creative and productive careers, and was asking them this question about, if you could press a button and get rid of bipolar disorder or never have had bipolar, would you press it? And what's fascinating is that quite a lot of people say no to this to this question. And in fact, in his documentary, everybody said no, and obviously they were a very biased group. But a large survey of 3,300 people with bipolar, 46% said they wouldn't eradicate this condition. And you have to ask yourself, what is it that actually is the reason that people are having some positive aspects of this? This is a quote by Jamison, who's a very prolific writer and clinical academic in America. And for those at the back who might not be able to read this, I'm just going to read what she says. So she says, people expect that you will welcome being normal and being appreciative of lithium, doctors, etc. But if you're used to only sleeping 5 hours or staying up all night or days at a time and now can't, it's a real adjustment. It's new, restrictive, less productive, and less fun. I always compare my current self with the best I have been, which is when I've been hypomanic. In short, I find myself a hard act to follow. And I guess what comes out of this is that in some states in bipolar, for some people, there is such a positive angle to this that it's actually, there's ambivalence about how to manage those experiences. So we were interested in exploring this further, and this is just a study that I wanted to highlight. Actually, Kat Taylor, who's in the audience, do you want to wave, Kat, did the interviews for this study, where we interviewed 10 people who had a diagnosis of bipolar, and we were asking them about, could they tell us about, help us understand better, what are these positive aspects that people are talking about? And really, it was about this sense of heightened experiential awareness, so things feeling more creative, senses seeming more heightened, the ability to do things much more efficiently when they were in that hypomanic state. But interestingly, even depression, people were able to, not when they were in depression, but afterwards, they were able to recognize that actually it had been beneficial in terms of their lives, in terms of understanding other people and about being the person that they'd become. And I've got a copy of the paper if people want to read in more detail or talk to Kat. Similarly, there's a really interesting book that's been published called A First-Rate Madness, and in this book the author explores the adaptive traits that in bipolar. So what they look at is historically people who've been diagnosed with bipolar, and actually there are certain traits that tend to accompany these experiences which make people more empathic, more creative, more resilient, and actually the most fascinating one I thought was more realistic. So I think that's an interesting angle. We can play who can name the famous faces on this slide, and actually I have to admit that I don't know who they all are. So I looked at it this morning and I was thinking, I can recognize a few of them, but these are just an example of people who have achieved amazing things in their lives who have had a diagnosis of bipolar. So the NICE guidelines, which are the clinical guidelines that recommend to services what people should receive for different conditions. This is a quote that most service users with bipolar disorder have the potential to return to normal function with optimal treatment, but with suboptimal treatment have a poor long-term outcome and become a burden to families and society. I think stressing the importance of actually continuing to develop effective treatments and making sure that they're widely available to people. So this theme of recovery and focusing on what does recovery mean to people has been quite a strong one that Steve's been very much leading in Spectrum, along with many of the people in the room today. And this just highlights some of the key recovery themes that have come out from talking to people with bipolar about what recovery means to them. And some of you may have even taken part in this research, so many thanks for those who did. And I guess the key ones that came out were that recovery, people see recovery as a lifelong process. This is not something that happens and then you're recovered. This is a journey that continues throughout life. And that the important thing is really having access to personally meaningful activity. So if we think about, what is it that you want to do with your life and how can support be put in place to help achieve that, rather than how do we reduce symptoms, how do we prevent relapse? Because it might be that for some people the risk of a relapse is worth taking if it means that they're chasing their goals and finding their path in life. Obviously, really important, developing resources that will help self-manage health. So, having some strategies, some plans about how to recognize early warning signs, what to do when they're happening to stay well. And the last one was really having a kind of a model, a working model to understand mood. So why does my mood go up in these situations? Why does my mood go down? How do I make sense of this in a coherent way? And coming out of this work, we developed the Bipolar Recovery Questionnaire. So this is really designed for research and clinical services to use with people to try to get a sense of where they are in that personal journey of recovery at the beginning of maybe a treatment program, so that we can actually start to measure, can we improve people's sense of recovery with the support that's put in place. And that's freely available. If people, I've printed out a copy, I'll put these on the side. But if anybody wants to get copies of it, we're happy to email them, and would encourage you to have a look at that. And the Bipolar Recovery Questionnaire was used as a main outcome in a recent trial. And this trial focused on using cognitive behavior therapy for people who had recent onset bipolar disorder. So they were, I think it was within 5 episodes. And the trial looked at if we offer people a series of sessions of recovery-focused CBT, do outcomes improve compared to people who were having treatment as usual? And basically what the trial showed was that it was easy to recruit to this. It was a feasibility study, so we were interested in, do people want this kind of approach? And the answer was very much yes. Would people come to the treatment sessions? And again, the answer was very much yes. And actually, we found a significant improvement on the primary outcome compared to treatment as usual. So people were getting better on recovery measures, actually also on symptom measures. So recovery and symptoms are closely linked, but they're not the same thing. So I think it's important to highlight that. And then the last study I just want to highlight, which again I've got a paper if people want to look at, is for those of you who'll be very aware, but there's a big national program called IAPT, which is the Improving Access to Psychological Therapies program. And this has been a government-led initiative to try to roll out talking therapies for depression, for anxiety, and more recently for psychosis and bipolar disorder. And Spectrum was involved with Birmingham and Solihull Trust in developing the IAPT program for bipolar disorder. And it's essentially a group-based intervention, which I think Mark Stevenson's going to talk about. Hello, Mark. Today. So there's a paper which has just come out, which is available to look at those outcomes if people are interested or want to talk about that more. Okay, so that's a kind of whistle-stop tour to some of the work we've been doing. Really happy to discuss any of it in more detail. But we're going to move on to the talks, and I think the talks are going to really highlight the kind of factors that influence recovery. So what is it that determines the process of recovery? How do we prevent onset of bipolar? Providing recovery-informed support in routine practice, so groups and individual work. Some digital approaches to face-to-face, some digital approaches and face-to-face approaches to recovery, and ensuring that how do we involve relatives and families in this process as well. And I guess the aim of the day is really to present this work and then move on to have a look at how does this work translate into materials that people with lived experience or working clinically can take away, and how can you use those in your own practice. And that's where we'd really like to hear from you about what you think of these materials, whether you think that there's something that can be useful, and hopefully that will start an ongoing conversation in which we can find out how to make recovery-focused approaches more prevalent.